Well, hey there, junior high Old Testament people. This is Mr. Axum taking some time out to review what we learned in class today. So we have now left the book of Genesis and we are into Exodus. And we're looking at the first 18 chapters, doing an overview. Watched a really cool video. Um, and so this is kind of the handout that we were looking at and went over there. So the book of Exodus starts with the descendants of Jacob. They've completely relocated to the land of Egypt. And as they come in, there's 70, a total of 70 men and women, boys and girls. So it's a lot, but it's not a ton. And the person who's really been the blessing from the middle of Genesis all the way through the end of the book of Genesis is Joseph. He is the 11th son of Jacob, and he has been raised up. God has raised Joseph up to this position of power and authority, second only to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh gives the land of Goshen for Jacob's family to live and prosper. But unfortunately, Jacob dies, and so does Joseph, and then so does even the Pharaoh who knew both uh, Joseph and Jacob. And so for 400 years, there's this passage of time where the Israelites are growing, but the Pharaoh feels very threatened by the growing numbers of Israelites. And so the people of Israel, as they're living in Egypt and growing and becoming more numerous, they're being fruitful, they're multiplying, and they're filling the land. And that's a direct reference back to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28, where that's the command for Adam and Eve. And eventually it becomes the command that's passed on to Noah. And it's definitely the command that God gives to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. But because Pharaoh feels very threatened by the growing numbers of Israelites, he has a strategy to enslave all of them, and he orders that all the boys of the Hebrews be killed by being thrown into the Nile River. And so it's at this point in Exodus that we see the Israelites crying out to God, and God is now going to begin his rescue plan by raising up Moses. And what's unusual is that the very act of throwing a person into the Nile River, just like the Egyptians were doing to the Hebrew male boys, now this woman um, puts her son into a basket in the Nile River, and that ends up leading to the raising up of this guy Moses to be the deliverer of God's people. And so it's in chapters 5 through 15 that we see God having raised up Moses to be his leader, called him, sent him, commissioned him, that Pharaoh is confronted by Moses. And what happens, unfortunately, is that Pharaoh's heart begins to grow hard. When Moses appears and reminds Pharaoh of who God is and who he is, and the fact that he has enslaved God's people and he has to let them go, instead of repenting, instead of admitting that he's wrong, Pharaoh just becomes more hardened in his ways. And so this is what leads to the plagues. And the first set of 5 plagues, the blood, the Nile River being turned to blood, and then gnats and frogs and flies and the death of cattle. This all happens, and the scriptures seem to say at each point that Pharaoh's heart grows very hard. And then there's the next set of 5 plagues of boils and hail and locusts and darkness coming over the land, and then finally the death of the firstborn sons. And so the point is that God knows that Pharaoh is going to resist, but he gives him many opportunities to repent. And we see that throughout the scriptures, that we saw it with Cain and Abel, and God warning Cain that sin is crouching at your door, and it desires to have you, but you need to not do that. You need to repent. You need to turn. And so he's giving Pharaoh this opportunity, and Pharaoh is not doing that. Then comes the final and last plague, which we refer to as Passover. And so this is a direct attack on Pharaoh himself, and it's coming because Pharaoh has enslaved the people of Israel, God's people, who are supposed to be in the land of Canaan, to be a blessing to the nations, and yet Pharaoh has them locked up. And so this is an attack on Pharaoh and his household, particularly his son. And but God provides a means of escape from this plague to the Israelites through this means, this ritual of slaughtering the blood of an unblemished lamb, and that turns away God's wrath. And obviously, just even saying that phrase makes you think of Jesus and what he has done for us. That his blood was shed, that the wrath of God might not come upon us, but it actually fell upon Jesus himself. It's after this that Pharaoh finally allows the Israelites to leave. But then, as typical, he changes his mind. He comes racing after them, and that leads to his own destruction. And what happens right after that is the very first song of praise in the whole Bible in Exodus chapter 15. And it's beautiful. It's something that you should read that retells the story of God reigning as a king and rescuing his people from slavery and death and giving them the promised land. And then the final few chapters that take us up to chapter 18 is this journey that the Israelites have once having crossed over the Red Sea. And now they got to get to Mount Sinai. And it's filled with complaining and grumbling and murmuring. And we're sort of left wondering, wow, is Israel's heart becoming hard like the way we saw Pharaoh's heart becoming hard? There's some challenges and difficulties, and the Israelites do not seem to be responding well. And then at the very bottom, you saw this pyramid, and so at the very top, you're seeing like these really, really important essential knowledge questions. So, what's led to the change in the relationship between Pharaoh and the Israelites, and how has Genesis 1:28 been fulfilled, and how is Moses' birth and Passover God's way of getting back at Pharaoh? And finally, is whose hearts are getting hard in this story, and why are they getting hard? And then just some basic short-term knowledge: the number of Israelites that came into Egypt, and the number of years that the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, the names of each of the plagues, the chapters where Israel's in the wilderness, and the chapters where Moses confronts Pharaoh. So down here at the bottom is sort of short-term information, and then up here is just like some really essential things that we need to remember and know as we studied this first half of the book of Exodus.